Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short, and of course, our flagship Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on the Bear Market Brief.
I think it would be fair to say, and indeed unfortunate, that Ukraine is having a bleak fall. Between consistent air attacks and a Russian offensive, a costly one, but one that is taking ground, things have been really tough, and that was before the reelection of Donald Trump. Welcome to the Bear Market Brief. I'm your host, Aaron Schwartzbaum. This episode will be taking a higher-level tour, if you will, around some of the issues relating to the war, certainly in light of the U.S. election. That covers the state of Russia's economy and political economy, the state of Western foreign policy towards Russia, particularly in Europe, as well as some of the dynamics we see on the front. This episode came together in a sort of funny way. Our guest this episode around, who I will introduce in a second, actually spent election night at my house watching the returns with my family. Led to some conversation, to say the very least. Dr. Janis Kluge works at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, that's SWP, in Berlin, where he is the deputy head of the Eastern Europe and Eurasia Division. He consults the German government and Bundestag on foreign policy issues, mainly related to Russia and the war in Ukraine. His research focuses on Russia's economic development, Russia-China relations, and economic sanctions. He holds a PhD in economics from Witten-Herdecke University in Germany. We had what I felt was a free-flowing, fascinating conversation that ranged from the very practical to the fantastical. I hope you enjoy. Janis, welcome to the Bear Market Brief. Great to have you by this episode.
Hi, great to be here.
So let's start with question number one, basic one I ask all the guests. What is keeping you busy these days? Tell me about your research focus.
So my research focus is broadly Russia, but I do have a specialization. I have a background as an economist, so I've been focusing on the Russian economy and on the impact of sanctions on the state of Russian war production and so on. So these are the main issues right now. I'm currently writing a short paper on sort of the turning point of the Russian economy, the question where Russia is headed in the next year economically. So that's what keeps me busy at the moment.
Well, perfect guest given the content we focus on here at the Bear Market Brief. Let's turn to some of the functional questions here. You recently tweeted. Are they still tweets on X? Are they X's? I don't know.
I call them tweets.
You recently tweeted, though, that in relation to the war in Ukraine, we are currently looking, and I quote, straight into the abyss. I guess the question that raises for me, where are we?
Yeah, you picked a really depressive start for this conversation, but I guess it's fitting to the overall situation. And of course, my tweets are mostly, it's I guess a European view or a German view on things. Some things might look different from the States, but I think throughout this year, it has been quite difficult to be optimistic, and we are now at a point where, it's just becomes increasingly hard to argue how Ukraine could avoid losing this war. So this is how I would put it. So if we look at the front lines, Russia is moving faster than ever in this war. If you except for the very early days. We see that Ukraine's energy system is doing worse than at any point in this war. We see that also Western aid is slowing both in financial terms, but also there are limits to production capacity. Although Russia has these horrible losses right now at the front line, and although, as I said, there are some risks to Russia's economy, at the moment, it just really doesn't look good. So this could mean that we are headed towards Ukraine losing. And the bad thing, or also the reason why I always try to, I don't know, maybe I'm a bit too alarmist, but I try to um, tell the Twitter audience that this is serious, is that I think there is a misunderstanding of what Ukraine losing means, and many simply expect that Ukraine losing means, okay, then they will have to do without their territories, the ones that are occupied by Russia, and then the war will be over and this will be fine. But you and I know that this is not how it's going to end, and it's not. Ukraine losing will be much more dramatic and much more painful than just simply freezing the front lines.
For those who are not you and me, what does Ukraine losing mean beyond the territorial concessions, quote unquote?
Well, I think that for the Russian side, this is actually not the main goal. And even if you look at statements from Putin, which have been quite consistent throughout this war, then what he's aiming for is essentially regime change in Kiev and sort of a limit on Ukraine's military, which would make Ukraine very vulnerable and essentially controllable by Russia. So Russia is not trying to extend its territory. It is, it's not trying to, at least it's not the main point, to keep Ukraine out of NATO, but this is about, regaining control over Kiev by installing someone who is Russia friendly or who can be manipulated from the outside, or at least put Ukraine in a situation where it cannot defend itself. And the annexations that happened in autumn of 2022 are more like an instrument to achieve that, and a way for Russia to commit itself to the war. But they are often misunderstood as the main goal, like as if Russia was, it was about this territory, which it isn't. Although these annexations clearly present a big obstacle for any kind of settlement or negotiations, because Russia doesn't control what it claims to be Russia now. And so overall, I would say that Putin is essentially trying to regain control over Kiev. I would say regain because, there have been some Ukrainian presidents in the past which, were closer to Russia or were, more Russia friendly in their policies. And I think that's essentially what Russia wants to go back to. But now it, means something completely different because, Ukraine has resisted Russia. So from the Russian perspective, it must be shown that, it's never good to resist Russia and that is to have dire consequences. And so this is why I think they want to exchange the leadership. They probably want to crack down on everybody involved in this war. This could lead to huge amounts of refugees. But, also for the West, it would be a huge, strategic defeat handed to it by Russia. And so, I mean, there are many implications, but essentially what Putin is after is still, control over Kiev, if not by Russian soldiers marching into the city, then by creating conditions in which Ukraine is so vulnerable that it can be manipulated or pressured from the outside.
What is this war about, in your view?
Well, it's that's a very good question, and I think that there is, even at this point, no conclusive answer. It is clear that before 2022, Putin saw Ukraine slipping away. I mean, I believe that the Minsk agreements, sort of these agreements that were in place after February of 2015, when the so-called separatists occupied eastern Ukrainian territories. These agreements were actually meant to be sort of the foot in the door for Russia, but a foot in the door of Ukrainian politics, not just these territories, but a way in which it would still have influence over Kiev. And I think
for listeners, I believe part of what you're getting at was that the two quote unquote separatist republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, would essentially have veto power in foreign policy. If I recall correctly, I'm out of the loop. Is it something along that line?
Well, I think that it would be a possibility for Russia to ramp up pressure on Ukraine when they want to, by re-escalating this conflict at any point, or by forcing Ukraine to, have certain changes to its domestic policy. I mean, so the Minsk agreements were essentially a way of Russia where it could demand something from Ukrainian governments. That would be difficult to deliver, changes to the constitution and so on. That although Ukraine undertook some steps to sort of fulfill its side of these Minsk agreements, it was clear that it wasn't Russia's intention to basically let go of these territories and let Ukraine be whole again and be independent. So and what I think what initially triggered this conflict, I mean, there are many theories about what went on with Putin during COVID and so on, but I think that he sort of saw Ukraine slipping away, and so he thought, we have to draw a line here, otherwise it will be lost, and then everything unfolded differently from what he expected. So I mean, there's not everything that happened this war was planned to happen like this by Putin, but I think this was the initial idea to regain control over Kiev, and also show to the West, that that we are basically trying to have more influence than we have actually, let's say, military power to back up, and that Russia can actually control these countries in its neighborhood, even against our will. And so I think this is why he started the war. It was extremely, I mean, it was to some degree unexpected. It was very risky, but yeah. So I think, and afterwards, it sort of changed what this war is about. I mean, afterwards, you know, the, once Russia invaded, there was, of course, no turning back. And this triggered a lot of changes within Ukraine. It triggered a lot of changes within the West. And because it wasn't over after 3 days, as maybe some in Moscow assumed, it turned into this huge, into this huge war, which is, and on top of that, sort of a conflict between Russia and the West, although this is not, I think, at the core of this. And it just simply became much bigger. But yeah, so this is, I guess, why it's sometimes difficult to say why is Putin doing this. I think in the beginning he thought it would be a smaller war, and this is why he started it. And then the war sort of it developed its own dynamic, and this is sort of the explanation of a lot that happened in the last 2 years.
Let's just begin to zoom in on some of the economic questions. It's what this podcast is ultimately about. So there's two kinds of angles. We're going to focus, I think, on Europe and Russia today. We will definitely do an episode on U.S. foreign policy. You've been, I would say, fairly outspoken about the need for Europe to take on a greater role in protecting, defending, supplying Ukraine. Now, there's two reasons Europe hasn't been really able to do more. One is, as you mentioned earlier, simple like math production. You can only build a certain number of missiles per year, and it takes time to ramp that up. I think that one's more straightforward. But broadly, what else has constrained Europe, in your view, from making decisive decisions here, for lack of a better term?
Well, I think that there are some structural issues which are, the reason for that is that Europe is a collection of countries and not one country. So there are collective action problems, both among member states of the European Union, but also within member states, so among parties. And so the whole process is really messy. And this makes it difficult, or more difficult, to simply agree on something, and even more difficult to sort of have a common vision on where the continent is going. So I think that actually these collective action problems are the main issue, and they have essentially prevented the EU from doing what it should have done, which is preparing with more, let's say, also with more financial means, but also with more urgency to the situation that we are in right now. So if nobody is really in the driver's seat, then, and everybody's just looking what the others are doing and comparing what, let's say Germany is looking at what France and Poland are doing. And then we are saying, okay, if they are doing that, then what we are doing is fine. So, I mean, in this kind of setting, nobody's really in the driver's seat. And this has led to a situation where, as a collective, the European Union or European countries are not capable at the moment of achieving what they promised to achieve. I mean, I think this is the crucial point, that in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, that we had all these very committed statements about, you helping Ukraine, this as long as it takes, which is now slowly morphing into as much as it is possible. So, I mean, there's sort of a walking back of these initial promises, because I guess, slowly some governments realize that some of these promises might be difficult to keep, although I think it hasn't really sunk in yet. And, my biggest point of frustration, I would say, is that, as I said, that there's simply the lack of urgency. So we had a pretty powerful response to COVID. I only, of course, can speak for Germany, where we built out these vaccine production facilities in a few months. It was like a collective effort and was really fast, exceptional, and effective. And then we did the same for our gas dependencies. So we built out these LNG terminals, and we're overriding all the environmental concerns. There was some special regulation and laws for that, so we can get these LNG terminals online before the next winter in 2022. But we did not do the same with arms production. And this brought us to a situation. I mean, you could argue of course it's more complicated to build a factory for artillery grenades than it is to build an LNG terminal, but it has been 2.5 years since everybody started saying, at the rate that we're giving Ukraine weapons right now, we will not be able to replace it after a while. And still, there was not the sense of urgency. And, the issue of Ukraine sort of at some points got lost among other issues that keep politicians in Europe busy. And I think that what we are getting now is sort of the payback for that. And I just believe that it could be worse than many are at this point still expecting in Europe.
So I have, I guess, a U.S. foreign policy question, but it's from the perspective of Russia in this case. So Trump, returning to office, has talked up consistently his ability to make a deal with Putin. But if Putin believes he's winning, and as you said, Russia's military is advancing faster than it has in a very long time, why would Putin even negotiate right now?
Well, I like the way that that Sam Green from SEPA put it. He said that Putin really wants negotiations, but he doesn't want to negotiate, and I think that that really captures it. I think that on the one hand, Trump is as difficult to predict for Putin as he is difficult to predict for anybody else. So we can actually see some kind of preparations on the Russian side for the Trump presidency. You see actually a lot of urgency apparently that Russians have, because they are accepting such high casualties at the front line just to get some things moving before Trump is in office, just to gain some more ground, just to gain back Kursk. There's a huge effort to do that as well. So it seems to be that they are at least respecting that some things could change with regard to the external conditions of how this war is treated in the US, and what this could mean for Russia. But they don't really know either. So there's some preparation. But it is extremely unlikely, I believe, that there will be any agreement on substance. So Putin could really try to use the process of negotiations to gain something in the process that he doesn't have to gain by military means afterwards. For example, he could say, "I will start to negotiate, but first Ukraine has to get out of Kursk." And then maybe Trump will think, okay, if that's what the price is, then Zelensky, get out of Kursk, and maybe then they will try to force Zelensky to do it, but afterwards Putin will still not be very compromising. I think actually that Trump will be surprised how uncompromising Putin will be on substance. And I think there are many things. You also, I think, in your question, you already alluded to it. For Putin, it is there is currently no incentive, and it might even be a risk to have some kind of settlement. If the war ends, if the fighting ends, if this external crisis that has changed Russian political life so much, if this suddenly ends and you have losses of, I don't know, upwards of 100,000 Russian soldiers, and then you explain to the Russian elite and population that you did this for these territories in eastern Ukraine, this is not really a good look. And I think it would be risky for Putin to end the war at this point with anything less than a resounding success. So this is why I believe that on substance he will not be compromising. He sees that if everything continues as it is right now, that he might achieve what he actually wants in the end, and he might actually achieve control over Ukraine, or at least the collapse of Ukraine.
To editorialize, there seems to be like something very identitarian about like Putin's conception of Ukraine. Like it's not a political thing; it's about his fundamental like worldview and who he is, which is interesting. You look at a country like Finland, which borders Russia and is very close to St. Petersburg. I've almost made that drive or ridden that route on the bus. They joined NATO and it was okay, but Ukraine seems more central. But we could go on a tangent about Russian identity and perceptions of history for a very, very long time. I want to ask about Russia's economy, and I just can't help but see this as kind of like a Schrodinger's box situation, just to mention famous Germans. On one level, I am reading more reports that things are, I don't want to say coming apart at the seams, but there's increasing pressure in Russia's economy. At the same time that Russia's economy is also way more resilient than everyone thought it would be. So I guess, which is it?
Well, I mean, there can be pressure and resilience at the same time. So, Russia's biggest problem at the moment is capacity. So the problem is that they have essentially zero unemployment or very low unemployment, and this limits their potential to grow. And this is why all this fiscal stimulus that comes from the war spending, the increasing war spending, a lot of that turns into inflation and rising prices. This doesn't mean that Russia is going to collapse, but it just means that the central bank now has to try to cool off Russia's economy. It's overheated, and this means that there will have to be a few quarters in which Russia's economy doesn't grow, so that sort of its production capacity can catch up with the demand side. And I mean, of course, there are risks, and the risks are rising. It is at the moment not clear how long this will take. How long it will take for Russia's central bank to bring down inflation, which has been not critically high, but it has been rising, although Russia's economy is already slowing down. So there's, sort of could be a path to stagflation there. And this is a risk. There's also a risk because external conditions can worsen at any time, especially the oil price. But if that doesn't happen, there's at the moment not really a huge stability risk. I mean, one maybe potential risk that I should also mention is that if there was a policy mistake, so it might be that the central bank over tightens monetary policy, and this leads to an uncontrolled slowdown or hard landing. This could also be a scenario of risk. But in a situation when you have the government being so expansive, if you have so much fiscal spending, this is actually, I guess, mitigating a lot of the risks of a slowdown that there could be. And I think that some increase in unemployment would actually be desirable from the position of the Russian leadership right now, because unemployed people or people that run into issues with their debt, consumer debt, or their mortgage are very good candidates for recruitment for the war. So, I mean, to some degree, some slowdown, some economic stress, I think, is intended.
Now, I guess a broader question: what do people, be that experts or your people in the West broadly, what do people get wrong about Russia's economy? What don't they understand? What are people missing?
What they are missing or what they were missing. I mean, of course, we had this huge discrepancy between the initial expectations of what sanctions would do to Russia and what actually happened in the end. As you recall, all international, financial institutions, IMF, but also Russian financial institutions, Russian central bank, everybody was expecting Russia's economy to contract by somewhere like around 7% in 2022. In the end, it was somewhere between 1% and 2%. So there was, of course, the expectations were wrong. And some of that might be misconceptions about how the Russian economy works. And, maybe overly, let's say, simplistic view of how vulnerable they are. But some of that was also simply, the difficulty of predicting how such of this huge economic experiment that sanctions are, how this plays out. And, how Russia would react itself, what the Russian government would do. And finally, also the factor of external conditions, how favorable they would be, meaning commodity prices, but also actions of other governments, how, if they would stay away from Russia, if they would assist Russia, and so on. So some factors are, in some ways it is due to a lack of understanding of the Russian economy. In some ways, it's simply the unpredictability of such a major economic shock and the major economic experiment that these sanctions were.
I have, I guess, another question. We're talking about Russia's economy, kind of the struggles of sustaining a war, but there's also the question of political economy, and you have talked about Putin's kind of broader march, broader confrontation with the West. I guess my question is, trying to kind of summarize it here: can Russia afford to stop fighting? In kind of a weird way of putting that.
Economically, it wouldn't be a problem. I mean, economically, I know there have been some. There has been some commentary saying that if the war ends, this would be a recession for Russia. And, if we believe that Russia would actually stop to spend as much on the war, if the military budget would shrink drastically, then that could be the case. But I wouldn't expect Russia to really lower its military spending, even if the fighting stops at the moment, because what Russia went through, in my view, is sort of like its own Sputnik moment, like a situation where they realized they're much weaker militarily than they thought, because their invasion into Ukraine failed initially. And this was enough for, I think, a multi-year period of investing a lot more in the military. So they're already expanding sort of the manpower of its military, but Russia will not go back to the same level of military spending from before the war, even if it stops now, simply because of the experience and because the security situation is completely different now. I think that actually, even if we have a ceasefire, Russia will keep up the same pace of military spending. So this is why I don't think there are huge economic risks like there would be an immediate recession, although it's clear that what Russia is doing now is in some ways, it's of course detrimental for the future. It means that sort of Russia cannot have a future that it could have had without this war, without sanctions. But it would not mean an immediate, recession or collapse if the war ends. So this is let's say, the economic view on it. I guess, politically, for most Russians, I guess most Russians would welcome the war ending, actually. That most Russians are not really into this. They just, try to pursue their private lives. They say, I'm not political and I don't care about it. They don't pay a lot of attention to it. And they enjoy the economic opportunities that they had in the last 2 years. They enjoy this war boom that Russia is going through. And if that is sustained, I think for most part, the population wouldn't mind, if these tensions would be diffused. But I think for the regime it could be more of a problem. So because the war has enabled such a much harsher crackdown on media, on officials, and so it has become sort of a pillar of this regime that you have this high tension situation. And if that goes away, I think this could release some centrifugal forces in the Russian regime. So I think among the elites, it's more difficult, but the population probably doesn't really care so much.
I want to pivot back to foreign policy for our last question. Imagine a world where right now things have gone a little differently. It's not just a European Union, it is a European Federation, and you are sitting in the driver's seat of this federation. You get to pull the policy levers. What do you do as Europe? Assuming things in the war had kind of gone as they had to now, what do you change on day one?
I won't be a dictator on day one, but I will definitely change the approach to, initially to military spending and arms production. I think that what we need is there sort of an emergency push to expand production, to deliver to Ukraine what it needs, so it can at least extend sort of the time that it survives. I mean, some people say this would be extending the war, and yes, in a way it would be extending the war, but if the war is extended, it means at the moment it means that Ukrainian defeat is delayed, and so this is actually a good thing. And in the first day, I think this would be the main focus. I would finance this with collective debt. This is probably something that's not very popular in Germany, but I think it would make sense for this kind of investment because it's a collective investment that benefits all of the European Union and or the European Federation in this case. But so this would be, I would sort of have a centrally controlled push, of course, in cooperation with the private enterprises in this field, to build up production facilities at the same speed that we managed to build up during COVID, and when Russia cut off the gas supplies, the same kind of urgency where every day counts, and everything else for a moment has to step aside. This would be my first push, because I think that in the end, this is what will matter. I mean, maybe not so much the financial support to Ukraine, that's also important, but we can always do that. But arms support, we might not be able to do at some point simply for capacity reasons, and we cannot afford to have this problem. And if we don't need these capacities in the end, it wouldn't be so bad. It wouldn't be such a big problem. So as an insurance policy as well, I would invest a lot in that.
Thank you for wildly editorializing with me and for joining Bear Market Brief. Great to have you. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks again to Janis and to you, listener, for joining. And if you happen to be one of my American listeners, a happy early Thanksgiving to you. So what do you think? If you were making foreign policy decisions in Europe, how would you approach the state of the conflict currently? What would you do with Donald Trump returning to office? Be sure to follow the Bear Market Brief at the Twitter and/or X handle @BearMarketBrief. Bear Market Brief is a project of the Russia-Eurasia program here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that's FPRI, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this initiative and on many others, visit fpri.org. We'll catch you next time.